a unearthed clip of political scientist John Mearsheimer, whose previous commentary on sort of Ukraine and the dangers of expansions of NATO has proved to be pretty prescient, but he's also very, controversial figure, I think, because he does place a lot of blame on the West for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there's a new clip that has been resurfaced of him from 2016, which has gotten a lot of eyeballs on it and passed around a ton online because of how incredibly prescient he is in his comments here. Specifically, he was asked what the biggest disaster in U.S. foreign policy was. The panelist next to him apparently said Iraq. His answer was as follows. Let's take a listen.
After a few more years, we may think that the crisis over Ukraine was the biggest mistake we made. I'm actually very nervous about the situation in Europe. The Russians have thousands of nuclear weapons. They're scared. And we're doing a number of things in Eastern Europe that they view as very provocative. And I've spent a lot of time studying great power behavior. And great powers tend to be paranoid. You cannot underestimate how scared they get. And when you take a country like Russia that has a sense of vulnerability, and you begin to push them towards the ledge, you get in their face, you're asking for trouble. Right? It's possible that they might use those nuclear weapons. It's possible you could have a real war in Eastern Europe. And this makes me very nervous, right? Iraq is a disaster, but the consequences for the United States, as I said earlier, are just not that great because we're so secure. But once you start introducing nuclear weapons into the equation, it's a different story. And I would also add that because the Cold War is in the distant past, most people, especially younger people, haven't thought a lot about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And they tend to be quite cavalier in their comments about nuclear weapons. And this makes me very nervous. So I think that you're right from the perspective of today that Iraq was the biggest mistake. But I think the Ukraine crisis, which goes back to your point about the third tranche of NATO expansion, may be seen as the biggest problem.
Yeah, I mean, look, he has always been incredibly cogent and well-thinking. In graduate school, him and Stephen Walt were two of the biggest influences on my personal thinking. They're both arch realists. And the realist school has really been poo-pooed and put down in the elite sphere of foreign policy thinking for a long time. The dominant thinking while I was in school that came to rise with Trump and the end of the Obama administration was Samantha Power kind of responsibility to protect called R2P, like America is this great moral power and must act through this humanitarian impulse, not just humanitarian, but should put values over national interests. And Walt's essay, I actually just pulled it up because it had such a massive impact on me at the time. He wrote it in Foreign Policy. It's called Would You Die for That Country? Why the United States Needs to Think Twice Before Calling Ukraine an Ally, and was specifically about what it really means to have an ally, what NATO membership, expansion towards the East. I'd never really considered that. And then the more I studied Russian history, I'm like, these are paranoid people, not the people specifically, but the leaders of that country. They all kind of lead in the same direction. They tend to invade their neighbors a lot. They also deeply feel insecure relative to their status in the West. They kind of really are their own culture, feeling besieged, not unfairly sometimes, for a long time. And the worst possible thing you could do is antagonize that country and induce a nuclear exchange, because that's probably the place where it would be the most likely to outbreak. And then relative to our interests, trade interests, and more, I mean, look, it's outside of the oil market, this is not even close to 10% of the world GDP.
So, yeah, I think there are a lot of things that were interesting in there. I mean, where I think I dissent from Mearsheimer is his formulation is this is inevitable, X plus Y equals this. And, I think that can have the impact of taking away responsibility from bad actors like Putin and, and laying the blame exclusively on the West, even though we've talked about the way that what we did in expanding NATO and some of our other actions made this outcome not inevitable, but made it predictable. There were warning signs there that, we should have heeded the words of Mearsheimer and others who were raising concerns at the time. It stood out to me, his comment that great powers tend to be paranoid, which I think is true, because a lot of people say, it's ridiculous that the idea that we're going to that NATO represents some threat to Russia in the current day. But, if the shoe were on the other foot, and we were looking at this, expansionist China or Russia, whoever it was, coming closer and closer to our borders, how do you think we would feel about it, regardless of what they were telling and their assurances that they were giving us publicly? So that's one. I would dissent from the idea that Iraq was really no big deal for the United States of America because—
To be fair, he is talking on the, grand strategic—
Yes, I get it. But I just want to put that out there. Obviously, Iraq was a total and complete disaster. And, I think part of how we end up in the place we are now, where we've had so little investment, we're so unprepared, and our country has, been pulled apart by the media, and a lot of those things go back to Iraq, and also the way that we completely upended the Middle East and created a disastrous security situation there as well. But the other part that I thought was really notable and extremely prescient was what he said about the cavalier attitude towards nuclear weapons. We barely, in the media coverage, and the media coverage of Ukraine has been extensive, we barely hear those reminders that, hey, this is a nuclear power we're playing with.
They actually have more nukes than we do.
And the one thing he talks about, this is a younger generation issue, but I haven't experienced this to be a younger generation issue in particular. In fact, from the polling, the younger generation is the most concerned, most skeptical about what our policy is and the way that we are prolonging and exacerbating the chance of a direct conflict with Russia. But there is certainly a lot of cavalier attitude about he's not really going to do it. He's just bluffing. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Why are you even considering this? And that is deep of everything that we've seen in this war. That is the most disturbing part to me.
There have been 2 times, when I really came to grips with this was actually North Korea. So I really remember thinking about this a lot. Back in 2017 when Trump was playing, with fire and fury.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, the North Koreans have a nuke that could destroy the city of Los Angeles. This is real. This is real. You could wipe Hawaii off the map. And they're crazy. I mean, they actually might do it. Imagine what the world would have looked like. It would have been like a World War I style event. And we were close. We were a lot closer than people like to remember. Thankfully, Trump, turned on a dime and decided to meet Kim, which I still think is one of the best things that he did as president. I wish Biden would go meet him, actually, because Kim is, definitely feeling aggrieved and thinking about doing some more destabilizing stuff in the region. So anyway, the second time has been Ukraine. And things are fine now, but you never know. I mean, all it takes is one thing. And a week later, consider the Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy woke up one day and found out that there were nuclear weapons or nearly operational nuclear weapons in Cuba. 5 days later, the world was on the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. And 13 days later, the crisis was resolved. And as Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, has said, it was luck that saved us from a full-blown nuclear war. He was like, Kennedy was rational, Khrushchev was rational, and at the end of the day, it was luck that saved us from a full nuclear exchange. So, I don't want to put the odds on luck for the next one.
Yeah, and let's not hand wave away the possibility of nuclear war. Yeah. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. More for you later. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.